It's so nice to see you all here today. Really, we're not expecting quite a crowd today. And I want to ask you one single question at the very beginning. Who is your favorite superhero? Superman. Okay, Superman, that's nice. But mine is Spider-Man. And the thing is, I'm not the only one. If you will ask people, almost half of them will tell you that Spider-Man is their favorite one. Wonder Woman is second with 13%, and Batman have 10%. You know, all the others combined, it's 38%. But why I'm even telling you this? Because that means that most of you will know those words. Remember, with great power comes great responsibility. Those are the famous words of Uncle Ben. This is like an uncle of Peter Parker, the Spider-Man. And you know, exactly, that is something that we'll be talking about today. This great power and great responsibility, so those challenges of backend service configuration. But before we start, let me introduce myself. I'm Szymon Zdanowski. I'm head of backend here in HashiCorp. My background is mostly Python and Golang. I have over 8 years of professional experience working as a developer, but also in different roles, like as a professional Scrum Master, technical project manager, or tech lead. But the projects I was working on were varying in size, in budget, right? Those were multi-million enterprises. There were startups that were just starting their way. But they have one thing in common. They were focusing on different aspects of integration and management. And you know, to give our talk today some structure, let's take a look at the agenda. So we'll be talking about 3 main things in terms of the life cycle of the config. Those will be those 3 challenges that we have. Because first, we need to define the config. So we'll be talking, you know, what config really is, what should we put there, and then we'll move to part about loading the config. So, you know, where do we store the config, and how do we load that? And we'll finish with talking about updating. So the part about when our application is fully working, and now we just want to do some changes. And, you know, before we start with all of that, why are we talking about that? Why is it important? It is because, you know, the world is changing. The things around us are constantly changing. And, you know, in real life, we have things like that, right? This is like an official slogan of US Marines with this real-life superhero Bear Grylls. Improvise, adapt, overcome, right? That's a way that we can manage or cope with the changes that we are facing. But in our IT world, maybe improvise is not such a good thing, right? So let's change it a little. In our case, let's say that we need to improve our applications, we need to change them, and of course adapt when some functionalities that we have need to start to act differently. And you know, one of the ways how we can achieve things like that is to make our application configurable. And that makes our application, you know, like all those things, right? Improving, adapting, changing. It's becoming easier, quicker for us to do. But how is it quicker, right? If, let's say, our application or anything that we are working on is not configurable, right? So if we want to make a change, this whole process that we can think of as stairs will have many steps, right? And you know how it is with stairs, right? The more steps there are, the harder it is to go up. So, you know, that means that we need to do this code update, right? Because we do not have config. Then we need to test those changes that we did, right? Then we need to build again, deploy, and finally, our change is live. But that means that simple thing that we wanted to change was as big as any other feature that we are doing. And if we make our application configurable, that process is much more simple, right? Because we do not the code change, but configuration change. And once we do that, maybe that's a little bit simplified, but our change is live, right? And you see how this process is much, much quicker. But again, let's remember good old Uncle Ben, right? This process is quick, it's simple, but it's a great power with great responsibility, right? Because any simple mess up in this config could mean that our application stops working, or we have any other issue that will cause, sometimes consequences that will be hard to reverse. Okay, so we know why is it important, right? So let's roll up our sleeves and get to work. First thing that we need to do is to define this config. But what config is? We can look at the definition, right? So the thing is that, okay, it's a set of rules and values that once applied to our application changes how it is behaving, right? But reality is that we do not even need such definition, right? Because for many of us, the config should be really a natural thing, right? Even since we were kids. That's something that we were used to, right? Options in our games that we played and so on. And that is a form of config. Of course, in our world, we are more used to things like that, in which we have this as some text file, which, to be honest, for example, that previous screen, right? Finally, possibly it was translated to something like that. And the only thing that we need to remember is that maybe as only some of us are directly working on this config, all of us in the project are at least partially influenced by that, because our config have an application scope, right? One change in config changes how it behaves. So when we have this config defined, let's add some values there. But there are multiple types of such values. So let's try to classify them. First option that we have is classification by content of those variables, right? We have two types, those that are sensitive and we really want to protect, and those that are insensitive and it doesn't matter if someone will learn those. So for example, DB password, that will be a sensitive one. Insensitive one, maybe list of file extensions that we allow users to upload, right? Because anyway, we're telling them that on the UI. And one thing to note, I guess, is that if we are talking about insensitive values, the challenge is that we need to keep in mind that some of them that may appear for us insensitive, for the attacker, for example, could mean a lot. Like, for example, DB engine, right? Still, maybe that's something that will allow some type of attack that we were not expecting. Okay, moving on, right? Next type of classification. Classification by scope. So we have local and global ones. What is the difference? Local ones are those that are applied to a single environment, right? So let's say that we have production, dev, staging, right? And this variable have different value on each of those environments. And this is the local one. While global ones are those that keep the same value across all our environments. So, again, local, maybe DB password is different on each of those environments. And global, maybe that DB engine, that's the same across all the environments. So, next that we can classify is how those values are changing, so their nature. Those values can be static, so those that we either hardly change or we do not expect them to change, and those that are dynamic, so those that we know that will be changing. So for example, hardly change, maybe that's a URL of our application or a path to some API, while those that are dynamic, right, SSL certificates, we know that they will expire and we would like to change them. And the last group that I specified is those that are classified by necessity. So those that are either required or optional. Required are simply those that our application will not work without. So, DB password, right? If we cannot connect to the database, our application will not work. Or those optionals that, we are fine if there are no specified, like SSL keys. Okay, there are no provided, we can use HTTP, not HTTPS. One thing to note here, another challenge, is that those optional ones often can have just some default values that we will be providing, right? And that's why they are not required. And that's something that you need to keep in mind, that if you provide default values for config values, that sometimes there may be a mistake. There may be a typo in your configuration. And by mistake, this hard-coded default value will be used, right? So if we do that, for example, for some JWT signing key, right? That would mean that if there is a mistake in the configuration, obviously, this default one is used and our security is impacted. And when we have values in our config, the thing to remember is that they are not only in one of those groups, right? Each value in our config will have a set of properties assigned to it. And this set of the properties will decide how this value is stored, how is it accessed, or how is it updated, right? So let's say that we have a DB password, right? So it's sensitive. So we do not want to store it in a plain text. So maybe we want to load it from some secret storage. We have SSL certificate that is dynamic, right? So if we know that it will expire at some point, we need to have a mechanism to update this value in a seamless way. And all of that you need to keep in mind while working with those values. And special case of those dynamic variables, config values, are feature flags, something that was already mentioned by Maciek. So feature flags are those special cases of dynamic variables that allows us to change how our application works without need of deploying new code. And feature flags can be dynamically enabled and disabled. That means that even non-technical users sometimes are allowed to do that. And feature flags can have like some lifespan that at some point we will decide to remove them. Example of such could be, when we release some feature, right? We turn that with like a feature flag, right? We check it's fully accepted, it's fully working, and then we remove this feature flag to make this feature like by default a part of our application. And let's take a look at some example, right? So let's say that we have new feature, right? One thing to maybe keep in mind is that this toggle is not, just do not need to be a simple yes or no, right? It could be based on multiple values that you have in your application. For example, let's say that you have two user groups. You have villains and superheroes. And I want to have a feature that is that's enabled for superheroes, but disabled for villains, right? I know, maybe location of Tesseract or something like that. And that gives us the possibility to use cool things like, A/B testing, maybe some users see one versions, they can see the other. It enables us to do the canary releases or even supports the trunk-based development, right? So the approach in which all of your code is pushed in a single trunk or main branch, and just the features that are incomplete are hidden under some feature flag that will be at some point removed. And feature flags can also be classified. If we take a look at how long these feature flags needs to exist and how dynamic this toggling decision will be, there are multiple types that we can define, right? So there are experimental toggles that we already were kind of touching on. So those that, a couple of users sees one, couple of users sees two. There are those release toggles, right? So we create a release with some feature, and once this feature is accepted, we remove the feature flag. But also, there are maybe some that are not that natural, right? Like, for example, ops toggles. Those are kind of kill switches that you can have in your application. You can imagine, for example, a marketplace app. And this marketplace app have a recommendation engine. But if you have a big load coming your way, because I know, maybe it's Black Friday, and you want to handle that load to optimize some things and do not need to spend time creating those recommendations during handling of users' requests, there could be a feature flag that is, enabled or disabled by ops that will, remove that feature, and that way you can serve your users in a quicker way or more effective way. And of course, that's something that's maybe not natural as well. There are permission toggles, right? So if you have some kind of paywall or premium users in your application, when they are accessing this feature that is hidden behind this paywall, that's form of a feature flag. And by the rule of thumb, I would say that when we define a config, follow those three rules. First, let's take a look at the organization in which you are working, or maybe the organization for which you are a part of, and so on, that there are often some rules, some good standards that you can follow. And follow that. Start with that. And then take a look at what can be changed in my application. What do I foresee that can be changing in the future? And what will be changing depending on the environment? And by following those three steps, you will be able to define your first config, right? And what is important to remember is that this is evolution, right? Do not go for the approach that, let's make everything configurable. There needs to be some trade-off, right? Let's make only those things that we foresee that will change, that will depend on the environment, but do not put there anything. Just keep it, standard, normal, and change it where there will be such need. Okay, so let's say that we have this config, right? So now let's try to load it. So the first thing will be where to store config. Who have any idea where we can store it? Cool. Yeah, exactly. That's a good answer. File is perfect. But maybe any others? Maybe that's not the best idea, but it's still doable. And all those answers are correct, right? Because there is no one answer to this question. It really depends on the application that you are working on, how often you expect your config to change, or even maybe about on the technical limitations that you have when you are working on some project. But as it was already mentioned, one way to do that is to use file. Exactly. Files are easy to read, easy to edit. We have multiple formats, right? So, for example, we have XML, right? So it have a structure. It's easy to validate. It have advanced options around searching for some values, so because we have this XPath, XQuery. But reality is it's really verbose and redundant, right? It's not really human readable. But still, if you need those things like strict structure, validation, namespace support, maybe that's the way to go. Of course, we have then JSON files, right? Those are quick. Those are easy to understand, but the reality is that they're pretty limited, right? We cannot have comments in JSON files. We cannot specify any advanced data structures there. It's, very simple. We have arrays, and basically that's it. But still, that's quick, right? Quick to parse, quick to load. One way to go definitely is to use JSON files. But then we have also YAML files. And YAML files are I would say, really exceptionally human readable. And that's why, that's because, they are following the Python-like structure with these indentations. You can add config, add different data structures, right? Like they have maps, sets, and so on. You can add comments to those files. To be honest, I would say that this is my personal favorite. But of course, there may be some limitations. That is even the case that some languages may not support YAML files in a full format. And one more thing, I guess, is that YAML is a superset of JSON. So if you want to use YAML, JSON could be a value that is there in YAML. And if you are currently using JSONs, I encourage you to try it out, because every JSON can be turned into YAML. And that definitely is something to try out. And then we have more exotic ones, right? Like, for example, this HashiCorp configuration language. That was designed mostly with HashiCorp products in mind. It's very cool if you are using the Terraform toolset. But, it's not that popular. It's somewhat exotic, right? But there are a couple of cool features, right? As you see, those values can be having like some patterns that that will be basically executed during config load, or even can use application-provided functions inside the config. And of course, when you will be working with files, it's good to use something that is battle-proven, or because you will have the problems that are in a way very typical. You will need to load this file, validate it, handle default values, and so on, right? So I totally encourage you to try those libraries, then account for Python and Viper in Golang, which will give you many of those features basically out of the box. Okay, so we talked about files, how cool they are. The disadvantage, I would say, that they are somewhat insecure, right? Because our whole configuration is there in this single file that we need to supply somehow. And that's always some risk. But still, let's say that this is our Batman, right? It's in the shadows of our application with all those cool formats and as gadgets of Batman. And the next option that we have is environment variables, right? They are fast, quick. They are basically there, right? Like that our OS supports them natively. But the thing is that they are unexpressive, right? It's basically a key values, right? So even here, when we take a look at path variable, if we want to have this as a list, we need to have some colon as a separator. But still, that's also a good way to go because they are secure, right, and quick to use. That's why we can call it a flash of our config storages. Then we have database. Database gives us a lot of flexibility, right? It connects to those feature flags that we were talking about, right? We can define rules that are very complicated and store that in the database, and based on that, do our configuration. I would say simply that we can do wonders there. But reality is that even if you are using database as a config source, you will still need to have some bootstrapping values, right? Because your application will need to still know how to connect to this database. So that's definitely some disadvantage. And as I mentioned, those wonders, of course, that will be our Wonder Woman. And then we have also option that is called like external config providers. So our application loads this config from external source, right? Maybe some microservice that we have that is handling configs for multiple services that we have because they share config in some way. Or maybe that's just some secret storage from which we want to pull the data. This is like a really super solution, and there is a Superman, right? But of course, I guess you can wonder why I tried to add superheroes to those types of config stores. And that's because those types of config storages can really work together, just as superheroes does. there is nothing stopping us with using, for example, YAML files in which secrets are stored in environment variables and loaded based on this file. Or even we can do hierarchical configuration, right? That means that first, let's say we load from some external config service, but then locally we have a config file that overrides values that we loaded, and maybe we have also environment variables that will override this as well. This gives us a lot of flexibility, but at the same time, it may be hard to determine from where this value is coming. So, but from where to load the config, it's not the only challenge, because then we can also consider how we load that. And there can be, I guess, three main ways that config value will be loaded, right? Either we load this only once and then use it. For example, this DB password, right? We load it, and then anytime we need a connection to the database, we use it, right? But there can be options in which this value from our config in a way needs to be cached, right? So we load this for a couple of times and use it for a couple of times. This could be, values that we need to keep updated, like, for example, JWT signing key, right? And then those that we need to load every time we want to use it. Maybe because, this is something that is so sensitive that we do not want to keep in memory for a long time. And then let's end up with a couple of best practices, right? So first, single source of configuration code. What does it mean is that try always to have a single abstraction from which your config is loaded. Do not have, like two classes that are loading the config file, and one class is using some of the fields, second class is using another set of fields. Always have a single source of truth for your configuration. And define a rule set for your config. And what does it mean? When you have a config, you know what to expect there, right? You know that this value will be an integer. Maybe you know the range that you expect for this value. So define it, write it up somewhere, and most importantly, validate against that. You have those rules, use them to validate when your application is starting, because it's better to give an error when application is just loading the config rather than when the value is actually being used. And last thing, do not reinvent the wheel, right? I mentioned those libraries, for example, right? Try to use something that is already there, battle-proven, because in terms of config, I would say that there are really hardly cases when you really need to do something that is fully custom. Okay, so we defined config, we loaded it, but now our application is fully working and we need to change something. So that means that we need to update our configuration. So how to approach that? And the simple answer is that we need to have a process. And why is that? That is exactly for those words from Uncle Ben, right? Great power, great responsibility. And if we do not have process, we will not know who, when, and what changed, right? And how to roll back those changes. What are the impact that those changes could cause. So to do that, if we have a process, we limit the risk that we'll face something like that, right? And our application will be down, or we'll have some issues that we were not expecting. And example of such process could be something that I was using in one of the projects I was working on, and that was really simple. We had a Jira in which first we were creating a ticket in which we were specifying the request for change. That, simply I want this value to be changed to another. But then we were also including this impact analysis in which we were providing, okay, those are the things that will change, that's something that could go wrong, and so on. Then there was an approval, so our management was approving that, yeah, okay, we are okay with that change, let's do that in that maintenance window. And once that was done, change was executed by the cloud ops, and validation was started. But to do the validation, I guess there are multiple things that we need to keep in mind, right? To have a fully successful config change, we need a couple of things. We need to have monitoring, observability, logs that we can check if, after our change that everything is still working fine. We should do basic sanity. And in case something goes wrong, to have a status page to be sure that we can share with our customers what is really happening. But that's not the only challenge that we have with updating values, because sometimes this update is more complicated, and that calls for the case of rotation. A good case of that is those JWT signing keys. So if we have some signing key and we want to update it, and if we would just simply replace it, that would mean that all the tokens that were already issued using it will stop working, right? So that is not something that we can do. That's why our application needs to be able to accept two values there. One, the old JWT signing key that will be still used for validating tokens, just in case, and new JWT signing key that will be used not only for validation, but also for issuing new ones. And only once that all those tokens will be expired, or we will be okay with them stopping to work, that's when we can remove the old one and keep only the new one. But how to handle that change, right? The values are being changed. If we are using file, this file is getting changed. So how we do that our application knows about that? And simply, there are two answers to that. Either we go with support directly in the application. So, we have, for example, some file watcher, right? We see that file with config was updated. Our application needs to be able to reload itself, change things that were affected, and so on. Or we can do that on the deployment level. That means that, our application will be restarted or maybe redeployed. But then basically it happens outside of our application. Just as you see here basically, right? Either Iron Man can fly on his own or he can use Queenjet. And conclusions will be that I guess you can see that even talking about those three layers, defining, loading, updating, config, there are many challenges that we have and we need to face. But reality is that in the world that is still changing and the applications that we do, that they need to adapt, improve, and change, that's something that is really crucial, and we need to support that. And for that reason, to make sure that it works and we keep track of that, I would like to ask you for one thing. Give me a one hour. That's all I'm asking you. Spend 15 minutes looking in your projects how you are defining the config. Is there everything that you need? Is there anything missing? Maybe you do not pay attention to things like secrets. Then spend another 15 minutes looking at how you load your config. Maybe currently you store that in a file, but moving that to environment variables will be better. Another 15 minutes, it's check how you update your config. Do you have this process defined? Do you expect things to be rotated, like this JWT signing key? And then spend the last 15 minutes on looking how to improve that situation. And that's it, what I have for you today. And if there will be any questions, I'm happy to answer them. If not, I'm staying with you. I will be there for the after party. Oh, sorry.
Yes, I have one question, and sorry if it's a side topic, but as not exact. No. Okay, it's better. So sorry if it's a side question, but there's something that intrigued me as I'm not a backend developer. You mentioned something called ops.
Ops toggles.
Yeah, ops toggles.
Yeah.
And you gave that example of marketplace.
Yeah.
And so, okay, we are expecting some heavier load because, for example, the Black Friday is coming.
Yeah.
And you want to prepare yourself for that. And I guess such toggle is not something like switch the more optimized version of the app, because if it's more optimized, you would use it all the time. So can you give an example of what can you do to prepare for that? Like, are you switching off some functionalities to make the app lighter?
Exactly. You know, every operation that your application is doing is taking some time, right? It's using some resources. And if you're facing a situation in which you have this higher load, and you know that if you keep using all those features, it will break because you cannot scale that much, or your environment is not prepared to handle such load. That's when you can basically disable those features just to make this operation work quicker, because less steps will be done. And we are talking mostly about features that are additional ones, right? Like, for example, maybe sending emails that or registration you can disable, things like that. That's it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? If not, I will be staying with you for the after party. So just as Maciej was saying, give me a tap on the shoulder and let's talk. So thank you.
Dziękujemy.